both of ours whenever we go to Las Vegas, oftentimes crashing in his extra bedroom.
Yeah, Christian Keith is a very good man, capital G, capital M.
Yeah.
He unfortunately had to cancel on the Lakers game we went to last night, but a Las Vegas player and one of the real nice guys in the community.
Round 1 is underway. Lundquist with a Sacred Foundry. He'll follow up with a Plains and a Daring Skyjack, as Keith will just have a Forest and an Elvish Mystic to get things underway. He does draw a Domri Raid for his second turn. You see him move a Blood Crypt around. His Jund Monsters deck list, not anything too crazy. He does have 3 copies of Xenagos the Reveler in his main deck, where some players have none, some players have a couple on the sideboard. It kind of varies about how people want to do that. 3 copies of Dreadbore and Mysium Mortars. Your normal creatures here. So his Black Splash, of course, is not very heavy, but he's also got 2 copies of Boon Satyr, so he's kind of deviating from what we've seen from a lot of versions of this deck, as he's going to play a Blood Crypt, it looks like untapped, go down to 18, and it looks like he might be moving towards the old Planeswalker here.
Yeah, and I actually spoke to Brian Kibler, who's contemplating playing Jund Monsters this weekend in Cincinnati, and he mentioned that he was also moving away from Reaper of the Wilds in this list and trying to be a little more aggressive, whether that's Gore Clan Rampager, whether that is something like Boon Satyr, but I think that's a development that's starting to get a lot more momentum in the standard metagame.
Keith is going to take his Domri down. He'll fight Elvish Mystic with a Daring Skyjack and just pass the turn back here. So Lundquist, on a clear board for the most part, is going to play a Plains. There is a copy of Dried Militant, followed up with a Loyal Pegasus, which we will certainly bring up for you guys at home, as this is not a card that we see a lot in Standard, but Ben is very skilled, so we might see a lot of it today as a Temple of Malice here from Keith.
Yeah, and there's a lot of standard decks now that are pretty soft in the air, Jund Monsters among them. Part of this is because of the decline of Mono Blue Devotion, it's less critical to have ways to block flyers, and the red-white aggro decks are always in the market for more one-drops. And of course, very easy to turn on its requirement with all your one-drops in Mutavault.
Keith going to play Temple of Malice, scry, leave the card on top. Doesn't hit with Domri and passes the turn back, and we're playing Elvish Mystic. Chances are that's a spell that's on top of his deck. He does just have 1 copy of Mysium Mortars. Could be a Planeswalker in Xenagos the Reveler, maybe one of the Dreadbores. As Lundquist is going to untap, he'll take a draw, and we'll see what he wants to do on his 4th turn of the game. As you see, he has a Brave the Elements and a Boros Charm in his hand.
Getting Domri off the board certainly critical. Benjamin's deck is very susceptible to Domri's fight power, as his creatures are all quite small.
Another copy of Loyal Pegasus after Ben does trade his Militant with the Elvish Mystic. His Loyal Pegasus takes care of the Domri, and he'll just pass the turn back, representing a multitude of spells. Again, Boros Charm and Brave the Elements in his hand, as Keith does draw a copy of Xenagos the Reveler. However, as you did mention, this deck is pretty soft to the air, and this is a great example of this, where Xenagos is oftentimes used in chump blocking mode a lot with the Satyr tokens. Not going to work so well here.
Yeah, this is exactly right. This is a great example of part of the reason to have Loyal Pegasus in the deck. And for those of you, this is sort of a question that comes up a lot with this text box. 2 Loyal Pegasuses can attack together.
Yes.
That it says they need to attack or block alone. So there's some confusion over whether or not you can attack with 2 copies of a card with that text box. The answer is yes, you can.
It's the old Emperor Beast drama. As Lundquist is going to use that Boros Charm to take care of Xenagos. Now, I know that Ben is a huge fan of Ajani Call of the Pride in this deck, and he does have a copy in his hand right now. He's playing 3 this weekend, along with 2 copies of Spear of Heliod, to be able to buff his creatures.
Yeah, Ben is actually not a big fan of Spear in this deck, by and large. I talked to him, in part because of the Bird matchup. I was a big fan of Spear being in the deck right now, because Chandra is so good against your creatures if you do not have Spear in play, but once Spear is in play, Chandra is basically uncastable. Yeah. So if you're on the fence about whether or not to play that card, how many copies of Chandra are in the metagame is a really determining factor.
Keith draws one of his haymakers in this matchup, arguably his best card, which is Stormbreath Dragon. You see his hand, he has 2 copies of Blood Crypt as well. So if he wants to deploy the dragon, he's going to have to go down to 12 to do so. And I think what he's considering right now is, if I play the dragon pre-combat, am I attacking with it or am I playing it defensively?
Yeah, and also can even afford to play this Blood Crypt untapped, as he has no untapped land to even play.
Yeah.
No non-Ravnica land to play untapped.
So he's going to attack for 2. He's going to put Lundquist down to 16. He's going to go down to 12 himself. This is going to be a Stormbreath Dragon post-combat. It's obviously on blocking duty, and he'll pass the turn back over to Lundquist, where it's 16 to 12 for life totals. Lundquist will untap, and he'll take a draw. Again, he's got multiple copies of Brave the Elements and an Ajani in his hand right now.
And he's just picked up a Precinct Captain as well, which is a really good draw for Lundquist. He's trying to just build up a board where he can use Brave the Elements to facilitate a lethal attack.
Yep. And there is the Precinct Captain, and Lundquist is just going to pass the turn back. So as you mentioned, he's trying to build up a big board and be able to basically two-shot him. Brave, pro-red in, Brave, pro-red in.
Yeah, the presence of Mutavault on Christian's side of the board does complicate matters, as it makes it a little bit harder for Lundquist to set up an alpha strike on the ground through Brave the Elements, but still building up the board is what he's in the market to do.
So are you saying that Mutavault is a good card?
It fulfills a lot of different roles.
Oh, okay.
A lot of different roles.
Okay. There is Brave the Elements by Ben. He will presumably be naming red here. And we'll see him come crashing into the red zone. Now, Mutavault's going to be on blocking duty, but Precinct Captain does have first strike. Makes it a powerful card. In for 4, it's going to put Keeth down to 8. Lundquist is going to play a Boros Lead post-combat, still having Brave the Elements available. Don't forget about that Ajani that's in his hand as well, as Keeth draws a copy of Domri Raid for the turn.
This is really good sequencing by Lundquist here, as he's now set up a potential lethal attack next turn with Brave the Elements. And he's still able to leave up Brave the Elements this turn as insurance against something like an overloaded Mizium Mortars.
Now, again, as you mentioned, Ben won the Standard Open the last time we were here in Los Angeles with this deck. I mean, this archetype. There are some changes here, obviously. Loyal Pegasus is in the deck now, where it wasn't even a card then. But he's been playing this deck for a while. Played it in Albuquerque, played it in a PTQ last weekend where he lost playing for top 8. He's been playing iterations of Boros for some time now.
Yeah, he's a very big fan of this strategy. It's really underrepresented in Standard by and large. You see very little of it in the Open Series, very little of it online. But Ben is a big believer in this deck, and he's often just tuning and tweaking it.
Domri's going to come down. Stormbirth Dragon is going to attempt to fight Precinct Captain. The big question here is Ben okay with this exchange? Because, again, he does have that Brave the Elements in his hand, but that Brave the Elements is trying to serve a larger purpose here.
Yeah, and if Lundquist draws a land next turn, what he actually can do is still set up a lethal Brave the Elements by giving flying and double strike to his Boros Elite and then braving. So I would be surprised if he fought over this, and he's just going to let it go.
Yep. So Lundquist may be on the plan of drawing a land this turn. He does draw a card. It's a copy of Soldier of the Pantheon. And again, the thing here for Ben is that he's not in a huge rush because he's at 16. And Christian is obviously playing defense in this game because if he were playing more aggressively, that Dragon would be coming into the red zone. So for Ben, I think he's more than happy to let that go, knowing that, okay, I'm at 16. Christian is on his heels this entire time, and the longer he's on his heels, the longer I have the opportunity to actually draw a land and kill him with the 1-2 punch.
Yeah, the thing is, Ben does not have all the inevitability in the world because Palikronos is such a threatening draw for Christian, both because, of course, the monstrous ability is very powerful against Benjamin's deck. Additionally, it gives Christian a green blocker. So Brave the Elements, trying to win with Brave the Elements becomes much more complicated. So Lundquist is in a favorable position from here, but he would like to end the game sooner rather than later because Palikronos and an overloaded Mizium Mortars would also require the use of Brave the Elements.
Yep.
So Christian certainly has some threatening draws in his deck, and it would behoove Lundquist to try to end the game as fast as possible.
Well, Ben is going to use the Brave Elements right now. He's going to name red. He's going to come across for 7. He's going to put Keith down to 1. And he might go after Domri.
Right, he might want to finish off Domri here.
For the reason exactly that you mentioned, that if Domri does find a copy of Palikronos, then everything changes.
Yeah, I had to imagine that Lundquist is just going to let Domri survive here because leaving Christian at 3 instead of 1 means that Christian has a lot more outs.
Yep. Now for Christian, you're trying to draw that one of Mizium Mortars. Not sure what he found this turn. He also needs to kind of make 2 blockers appear too, but one of those blockers needs to be a flyer because of Loyal Pegasus. You know, things get really, really complicated on this board state. This doesn't even take into account that Ben does have that copy of Ajani that Christian doesn't even know about either, which can make another flyer here. And as you mentioned right at the top, Patrick, you know, decks are pretty soft to flying right now, and this is certainly one of them in Jund Monsters.
Yeah, and this is part of the recipe for decks like Boros to beat creature decks that are objectively a lot more powerful, is to have things that make blocking complicated or some of your removal complicated to use. And having flyers is really good in the standard right now, and Loyal Pegasus, for as kind of silly as it looks on the surface, a critical part of Lundquist's overall plan.
And that's why we see Ben Lundquist win game number 1 here. We're going to move to the sideboards. I've got the Jund Monsters sideboard in front of me, so I'm going to take a look at a Sire of Insanity, a Chandra Pyromaster, a Garrett Caller of Beast, 2 copies of Mizium Mortars, 2 Ultimate Price, 2 copies of Abrupt Decay, 2 Golgari Charms, and then 4 copies of Mistcutter Hydra. Now, obviously, the Hydras are not going to come in here, but there are definitely some tools to be used. 2 Golgari Charms, 2 Abrupt Decays, 2 Ultimate Price, 2 Mizium Mortars. That's 8 cards. You look at Chandra, that's 9. That's 9 very, very good cards to bring into the matchup. The question, of course, is what do you want to bring out? Boonsader is pretty easy to sideboard out, I think, in this matchup. 4-2, just going to trade with something that's really not all that impressive. Xenagos is okay, but Xenagos was not very impressive in that game because Ben's text boxes actually matter quite a bit, and he's flying.
Yeah, I think Xenagos is pretty poor against creature decks that are flush with flyers, and even Soldier of the Pantheon can be complicated for Xenagos as well. So certainly based on, if Christian's playing this matchup for the first time, maybe just based on how bad Xenagos was in that game, might cause him to side it out.
And then I'm not a big Dreadbore fan. I think his other removal spells are actually better. But also, in that particular game, Christian didn't see a Johnny Call of the Pride where we know that Ben has 3 in his main deck, so maybe you do want to leave in some number of Dreadbores here. Kind of hard to say, but the removal spells that Christian is able to bring in, again, Abrupt Decay, Ultimate Price, Mizian Mortars, and Golgari Charm might be a little bit more high impact than Dreadbore.
I think that's really hard to get away from just bringing in as many removal spells as possible.
Sure, just overloading on those?
I think Palikronos and Stormbreath Dragon are 2 threats that are more than good enough to win the game, and so it's just about shoring up the earlier turns and making sure that Brave the Elements isn't a lethal spell. That was kind of the problem that Keith got into in that game in my mind. He doesn't draw very much removal, and so he had to play the entire game contorting around Brave the Elements, had to leave a lot of stuff on defense. It really complicated things for him. So just being able to use spot removal to keep the board manageable against Brave the Elements is a critical part about playing against decks like Boros.
Let's take a look at Ben's side of things.
Got a passivism, 3 Celestial Flares, a Boros Charm. He has 3 main and 1 in the sideboard, 2 Glare of Heresies, 4 Fiendslayer Paladins, 3 Banisher Priests, 1 Burning Earth. I believe that we're going to see the 3 copies of Banisher Priest and potentially the Burning Earth coming in as well.
I think the Burning Earth is certainly coming in. I really like the use of that card in Ben's sideboard because when you think of a card like Burning Earth or Mana Barbs or what have you, you think of a card that is very high impact, but it's a card that people normally play 4 copies of because they want to draw them. However, the problem with that is, first of all, it's a 4 mana spell in a deck where Ben only has 22 lands, so being able to cast it on time is, not going to happen. But also, the second copy, third copy, fourth copy have diminishing returns. The first one should oftentimes be good enough. So I like the fact that Ben just has one that, if I draw it, it's like, cool, it's awesome, maybe I'll play it. But, a lot of the times when you see decks like this, Boros deck or red decks in general, that have a low land count, that try to kill you quickly, a lot of the time they end the game with, 3 lands and then 2 Burning Earths or Mana Barbs in their hand. I know we've watched that happen many times, so just as a one-of, I like a lot.
Yeah, and also, it is a 4 mana spell in a 22 land deck, but bear in mind, most of the time that you're bringing the card in, the game is slowing down a little bit because your opponent's bringing in more removal spells. So it's not as high of a cost as having it in your game 1 deck would be. In the mono red list that I'm playing right now, I also have 1 Burning Earth in my sideboard with 22 lands, so I'm a big fan of that sort of build.
Now as these players do shuffle up, and we'll be starting game number 2 momentarily, you take a look at Ben's deck list here. You guys don't have it in front of you, but we do, and there's one card that is missing that you think would be in here. That is Bramaz. Ben, not a fan, apparently.
He does not like. I'm chuckling now a little bit because I'm thinking of some conversations that we had at work this week where he referred to Bramaz in some unflattering terms.
Maybe not fit for print.
The issue, of course, with Bramaz in this style of deck is just there's a lot of competition at 3. And the other 3 drops you could be playing, like a Ajani or Spear of Heliod, just synergize with your 1 and 2 mana creatures a lot better than something like Bramaz does.
No arguing Bramaz's power level, definitely off the charts, but it still has not found a home yet in our standard format. We thought it might be seeing some play in the sideboard of blue-white control decks, which it did for a little bit, but people have actually moved past that, kind of gone towards Archangel of Thune and some other options. As Lundquist is going to start off here, game number 2, with a Boros Elite. You saw Keith play a Blood Crypt tap. There's an Overgrown Tomb tap, pass the turn back. He's off to a much slower start this game, but again, he's a control deck in this matchup, so this shouldn't be much of a surprise.
Yeah, and Lundquist is really under pressure here to get some sort of board developed while also being able to hold up Brave the Elements. Yep. That's his recipe for success here.
There's a copy of Boros Elite. There's a Mutavault. I'm going to pass the turn back. So Lundquist can threaten large Boros Elites next turn if he'd like. Stomping Ground going to come and play tapped here for Keith. We'll see what he wants to play on this turn. He's got a Bevy removal. Looks like he's going to start with a Dreadbore to take care of that Boros Elite and pass the turn back. Again, he's got a lot of 1-for-1, and 1-for-1ing against this style of aggressive deck actually works out pretty well, as there's a Spear of Heliod from Lundquist. He'll attack in for 2, going to put Keith down to 17.
And that's the other part of the puzzle with Bramaz against the other 3 drops, is both Spear of Heliod and Ajani synergize so much better with Mutavault, which is the best card in the deck.
Yeah. Speaking of Mutavault, Keith will play 1. And you see his hand right now. He's got a copy of Palikronos. He does have the necessary green mana. He's got a Dreadbore, got a Scavenging Ooze. Plenty of options over there for Christian. It looks like he's going to go the Scavenging Ooze route. Can make that into a 3-3 whenever he'd like. but just going to sit steady at a 2-2. Also does have Abrupt Decay at the ready as well, so a lot of options here for Christian.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see him try to Abrupt Decay the Spear of Heliod inside of combat and try to get Lundquist that way.
Mutavault's going to come crashing in, it looks like, and it will be a 3-3. Ben, very careful here.
I think he sniffed it out.
Huh?
I think he might know that his Spear of Heliod is not long for this world.
And I think you're right. So, Abrupt Decay will take care of the Spear. The big question here is Keith willing to trade his Scavenging Ooze for that Mutavault? And I can't imagine that what he just says, that's fine, I'll take 2. See if Lundquist has a follow-up play here. Now, whenever you watch Ben play this deck, and I've watched Ben play this deck a lot, he is, well, I was going to say he is very, very good at leaving Brave the Elements up, but now he's giving it away.
The cat is out of the bag,
yes.
Unfortunately.
So Christian knows he needs to play around Brave the Elements, but to be fair, Ben, whenever you watch him play this deck, if it was Los Angeles last time or if it was in Game 1 and Game 2 this time, there is always a white mana up. Always, always, always.
Yeah, if you watch people who are actually experts play these style of decks, Paul Reitzel's a great example of this. A lot of these linear aggressive strategies have a stereotype of, yeah, you just throw all your stuff on the board. When you watch experts play these decks, you can see it's a much different play pattern. He's trying to be conscious of all the things that Christian can have here, trying to, you know, maximize his mana efficiency and the amount of damage he's doing, being conscious of trying to build up the board, so Brave the Elements is lethal, all that stuff. Lundquist is very skilled at it, and it definitely stands in stark contrast to how the deck gets played at times in the hands of lesser players.
Now, the big question here for Keith is, does he want to really rev things up now? Because he's got Stormbreath Dragon yet again, and we saw him play the defensive last game. Now, he's pretty high at 15, and he can really start to amp things up and get into the red zone with both of his creatures if he'd like. I'm going to be interested to see if that's exactly what he wants to do here, and he's just going to play it defensively yet again and pass the turn back. You know, putting the white deck on the defensive is some place it doesn't really want to be. And, you know, racing against the white deck is a little bit dangerous, but at the same time, can you afford to play defense against it the entire time? Didn't work great last game.
Well, Keith is in a much better position to play defense this game because he has both a red and green blocker in play. That's such a critical piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
When you're playing monocolor decks, you are almost have to race at all times against Boros because Brave the Elements is such a risk. When you're able to play a mixture of colored blockers or play a mixture of colored removal spells, then Brave the Elements is much less of a concern.
Temple of Triumph here for Lundquist. We'll see what he wants to do with this scry. He's going to leave that card on top. Again, we know, as does Christian, that there is a Brave the Elements in hand for Lundquist. He's going to play the second copy of Spear of Heliod, just 2 of those in his deck. Abrupt Decay took care of the first one, but the second one's here as Keith is going to untap. He'll draw a copy of Stomping Grounds. Important for a couple of reasons, but I think the most important one is that Scavenging Ooze now has another green source to go removing things with.
Yeah, and I really like the pacing that Christian is having in this game. When he has Palakronos in his hand, he definitely wants to play a slower game because he gets so much upside from playing Palakronos and then monstering it. So just keeping a slow pace, trying to use your removal spells in spots where you really don't care if they get hit by Brave the Elements like you're seeing right now, playing a mixture of green and red blockers to minimize Brave the Elements, and then setting up the game where Stormbreath Dragon and Palakronos can take over is just a really good setup from Christian.
You see Dreadboard going after the Loyal Pegasus. Brave the Elements is going to counter that on resolution. Gonna name red or black, one of the 2 colors there. And now Christian is going to play Stomping Ground untapped, so he's gonna go down to 13. He will deploy the World Eater and pass the turn back. So no cards in hand, everything's kind of on the table here for Keith. He's just gonna keep playing defensively, knows that the Brave the Elements that he knew about in Lundquist's hand is gone. Now the only thing he needs to be worried about is that Lundquist did keep a card on top with that Temple of Triumph. He doesn't know what it is, neither do we, neither do you guys at home. So we'll see what Ben did choose to keep.
I believe he drew a Precinct Captain was the draw here.
Stinky.
Well, it's certainly stinky now.
Yes.
It is stinky in the face of Palakronos, as are most 1 and 2 mana creatures.
This is true. This is true. And there is Precinct Captain. And Lundquist will just pass the turn back here, but Keith gets to untap with Palakronos in play. He's got 6 mana, so he can Monstrosity 2. If he draws a land, it can be Monstrosity 3. Spear of Heliod will make Monstrosity not be the complete blowout that it normally is, but it'll still be pretty good.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised here to see Keith do something like take care of the Loyal Pegasus and now start attacking with Stormbreath Dragon. The Spear of Heliod complicates his Alpha Strikes a little bit. He doesn't want to just send in his non-protection from white creatures, as the Spear will just kill it post-combat.
Yeah, that extra Spear text, which you don't get, you know, it doesn't come up a lot. The fact that it kills a creature that dealt damage to you this turn, but it actually is relevant in this situation. You see Lundquist did leave it up. So in comes the dragon for 4. Now Keith is going to try to start turning the corner a little bit here. We've got 5 mana. That's another copy of Stormbreath Dragon. And he'll pass the turn back. And yes, Keith could have played that Stormbreath Dragon and just gotten in the red zone again, but this one's going to play defense, and he can 2-shot him if he'd like to. You know, attack with 2 the next turn, put Lundquist down to 8, follow it up, do it again. That'll be lights out. So again, I'm kind of with you, and I like the way that Keith has played this game. And Lundquist says, "There's nothing I can do to get myself out of this situation. Let's go to the third one."
Yeah, when you have tools in play that are that powerful, like Christian had, it's better to err on the side of caution.
Yep.
Did he play the game defensively or conservatively? Absolutely. But that's a spot where being conservative is called for. Lundquist has a much more aggressive deck. He has things like Brave the Elements and Boros Charm that could potentially punk you out even if you're way ahead on the board. And Keith just has way more powerful tools to draw at that stage of the game. So just take your time. It's on your side.
But things will be a little bit different in this third and final game because Lundquist will be on the play. So Keith is going to be under the gun right away. And when you're a deck that has 12 dual lands in it, 12 Ravnica lands, you're going to be dealing yourself some damage, which is exactly where Lundquist wants to be. What we've seen in the evolution of our standard format is people are moving towards a second and or third color in their deck. And as we mention a lot of the times here in the booth, that, you know, adding those colors, while it isn't very difficult, there's a cost to that. And a Boros deck can take advantage of that cost.
Yeah, this is part of the reason that Lundquist really likes this deck right now. The same reason I've been playing a lot of Mono Red online and winning a fair bit with that deck as well. There's just a lot of 2.5 or 3 color decks. And the difference, you know, for Mono Red or for a deck like White Red Aggro, between red-green monsters and Jund monsters, one matchup is pretty rough and the other matchup is pretty favorable, and it's literally just the lands.
Yep.
That's all that we're talking about here. Even if the cards are identical or you get, you know, some incremental upgrades by having, let's say, Dreadbore, Reap of the Wilds, Ultimate Price, whatever the cards are that you're playing black for, the lands in the aggressive matchups are an enormous cost.
Yeah, part of the reason that I actually moved towards Jund monsters when I worked on the deck and played in the PTQ and what have you is because people weren't playing Mono Red, people weren't playing Boros, people weren't playing decks that could take advantage of the fact that your lands would come into play tapped or you deal yourself 2 points of damage. Courser can kind of undo some of the damage that you deal to yourself, things of that nature. But there were no hyper-aggressive decks being played, you know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, whenever it was that I played that PTQ. Now that, you know, we saw Red, White, Burn win last weekend. We see Boros kind of coming back a little bit. You've been working on Mono Red to great success online. You know, people are moving in those directions again, and if that's the case, you maybe have to go back just to the green-red version because even though it's not as good in the mirror, you have to be able to beat these hyper-aggressive decks. And, you know, with having that many dual lands in your deck and temples and what have you to facilitate the mana base, you know, you're going to lose games to your mana base, even though your mana is good, in quotes.
Yeah, absolutely. And, yeah, you don't always have access to all your colors early on in the game. And lands coming into play tapped or taking 2 damage off of them is, in some matchups, that's okay. And in some matchups, that's unacceptable. The metagame for a very long time has been decks primarily where that's okay. It looks like the metagame is starting to move to a place where that's no longer acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, just take a look at the Esper decks that people are playing now. You know, when after Pro Tour Theros, you had people playing Wafatapo's Esper deck, which had, you know, a bunch of temples, you know, a bunch of lands that come into play tapped. You're playing Hero's Downfall, Detention Sphere, all of these things where your lands come into play tapped a lot because you couldn't really get punished for it. And people said, oh yeah, well, if you're going to do that, I'm just going to move towards Mono Red with like Hammer and everything else and just absolutely crush you. But then Blue White, you know, has less of these lands that come into play tapped and more basics, and they were absolutely just mopping up Mono Red decks and aggressive-based strategies, even though they're essentially the same deck.
Yeah, I was advocating on my team's forums for Standard to play Blue-White instead of Esper.
Yeah.
And it's just because I would rather have islands and plains in my deck right now than 12 temples.
Yeah. On-tap lands are very powerful, but there are some players out there, Brian Bronduin, Todd Anderson, Huey Jensen, who are a big fan of the 12-temple version of Esper. So we'll see if that deck makes a showing this weekend. But we'll turn our attention here to game number 3 between Lundquist, again, our defending Los Angeles Standard Open champion, against Christian Keith from Las Vegas. Then going to start off with arguably the best one-drop in his deck in Soldier of the Pantheon. Certainly very, very good in this matchup.
Yeah, there's a lot of gold stuff going on. You can see a Dreadbore in Christian's hand. We saw Xenagos happen in the first game. So Soldier of the Pantheon actually has a real text box against Jund monsters.
And I wouldn't be surprised as Keith takes 2 to play that Elvish Mystic, that if Ben does attack, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Keith just trade immediately here. Yeah, and he has to because, again, his removal spells are all gold or double colored outside of ultimate price. Yes, gold Gary Charm can take care of it, but he doesn't have one in his hand right now. So as a result, he's just going to trade immediately as Lundquist is going to play a Dryad Militant, play Mutavault, and pass the turn back. Ben could have played Precinct Captain that turn, chose not to.
Yeah, and I think I like this sort of pacing from Lundquist. This is kind of an unorthodox play, but he knows that in the post-board games, Keith is so flush with removal that the likelihood that his Precinct Captain untaps is close to zero. He can also have Sylvan Caryatid this turn to block Precinct Captain, so he'd rather just have a better spread of attackers, and Mutavault facilitates that.
Keith will take 2 to cast Dreadbore, but he's okay with that exchange, as there is a Precinct Captain now, and Lundquist will pass the turn back, maybe hoping Keith doesn't have another removal spell. We know that he does, but he's going to start off with a Temple of Malice, a little Scry action here. Looks at a copy of Domri. You see his hand there of 2 copies of Abrupt Decay, a Stomping Grounds to facilitate that Pool of Chronos on turn 4, and a Stormbreath Dragon. So his hand is loaded, and he's keeping that card, it looks like, on top. Yes, he will. 2 mana. There is Abrupt Decay doing that now so that Brave the Elements doesn't come to the equation and pass the turn back over to Lundquist, who will take a draw. He's got a Mutavault. He's going to activate Mutavault, put Keith down to 14, and right now it looks like Ben may just be all in on this Mutavault plan because I think he's flooding pretty badly here.
Yeah, his hand right now is 3 lands, so he kept a pretty solid hand, but it has definitely not worked out so well for him.
Keith's going to go down to 12 to play the legendary Hydra, pass the turn back to Lundquist. You see Lundquist does have a bunch of lands in his hand, draws another one with Temple of Triumph. Top card's going to go to the bottom and can only pass the turn back as Keith will draw a Temple of Abandon. He's going to scry. We'll see if he finds anything that he likes, but his hand right now, again, is a copy of Abrupt Decay, Domri Raid, and a Stormbreath Dragon.
And this is one of the problems that Boros has here compared to, say, a build that is splashing blue or splashing black. You have no access to really clean removal for large creatures, and it does damage in the Jund Monsters matchup.
Keith opting not to attack here this turn as Lundquist is going to play a Temple of Triumph. You see his hand right now. He does have those 3 lands in it. Taking a look at the top card, that card's going to the bottom, just has to pass the turn back. Keith will untap those 4 lands. He'll take a draw step. It is another copy of Domri. He's going to start by ticking up this for his turn. He does not find a creature. You see his hand right now, again, of Stormbreath Dragon, Abrupt Decay, and that additional copy of Domri. Could go on the offensive in the air if he'd like. He's going to play Stormbreath Dragon, play defensively, and just pass the turn back. How do you feel about the no attack there?
Oh, I like the way that Keith is setting up this game. Like I said, he knows that his large creatures are good here. They're not going to get touched. And so he can actually wait to set up the Domri Ultimate if he wants to. And, you know, Lundquist has 4 cards in his hand. If you're in Christian's seat, you don't know what's going on over there. If it's nothing, if it's just lands or creatures that he doesn't want to cast in the face of this Pool of Chronos, you're going to win the game eventually.
Sure.
If there's some weird sequence of cards that you just haven't thought about or can't identify, or it's a bunch of Boros Charms or something, he could lose the game by getting too aggressive. So with all the tools he has to work with, Christian's in no rush. He's threatening to go Ultimate with Domri soon enough, and if Lundquist actually has powerful cards in his hand that Keith is just unaware of, he could potentially lose the game by getting too aggressive.
You see, Keith ticked up his Domri. I think what he accidentally did is leave a creature on top. Now, the thing with Domri is that you can look at the top card. It cannot be a creature. It can be a creature and you can leave it there, which is something I've actually done before to play around like a Thoughtseize type effect.
Yeah, you can also, this also comes up sometimes when you're bluffing with Delver of Secrets.
Yes.
So, you know, it's not mandatory.
Yeah. It says you may reveal it and put it in your hand. So looks like a slight misstep here. We'll see what's going to happen. Okay, so he's just going to leave it on top, so it wasn't a creature, it looks like, anyway. So it looks like everything is kosher here.
And not really critical regardless, as, you know, the spot that Keith is in right now, one creature is probably not going to make or break it.
He's in a good spot here. Now he's going to start actually attacking. And the reason I think he's attacking here is because he has mana available to cast Golgari Charm, to cast Abrupt Decay. Sure, it can't target Mutavault, but, you know, he's basically saying, okay, I have, you know, Monstrosity activation. There are a lot of different things that I can do. You don't really have any good attacks. And to be fair, I think Christian is sensing a bit of weakness here, which is I don't think that you are on, you know, like running Boros Charms to get the job done here.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. Just play conservative. Boros Charms is the only real threat at this point that Christian has to concern himself with. So just make sure to batten down the hatches, play good defense, and you can win the game eventually with your Stormbreath Dragon and your Domri Ultimate.
Spear of Heliod's going to come down here for Lundquist. He'll play a Plains and pass the turn back. Spear not going to have a huge impact on this game, as Keith does have 2 answers to it. It is an enchantment, so Golgari Charm can take care of it, or just the Abrupt Decay as well. We'll see if Christian wants to use either one of those here on his end step. He could also Monstrosity Pool of Chronos if he'd like, make it a little bit bigger, but he's just going to go with Abrupt Decay to get the Spear out of the way, because that ensures that Pool of Chronos can keep attacking. Mutavault the draw here for Keith. So that's what he was looking at with the Domri.
The game gets a lot harder for white-red aggro in the post-board games.
Yes,
you
it
can
does.
see. Yeah.
I mean, they just overload on removal, which is what you were suggesting in the first place, which, I was considering bringing out Dreadbore, what have you, but there are plenty of cards that Keith can sideboard out in this matchup so that he's just efficient creatures, removal, and then, Domri, which I don't think is going to have like a huge percentage chance of hitting in this matchup because I think he's probably boarding out some creatures to board in this removal. But the fact that, that you can fight and use it as removal spell is probably worth it by itself because he hasn't actually hit with Domri in this game.
No, again, Christian has creatures that are so much larger, and so Domri Fight is at minimum going to be one removal spell over the course of the game.
Yeah.
And Lundquist, again, no access to Detention Sphere, Ultimate Price, or whatever. He's not going to do something tricky inside of the Domri Fight. It's just going to happen. So even though it's not at its best in this matchup, it's still fine.
Lundquist draws his second copy of Spear of Heliod. You see his hand. He's going to play the Spear. He's just going to pass the turn back over to Keith. Don't think there's going to be any Mutavault activations here from Ben. And he will cast Golgari Charm. Will Keith to take care of the Spear. So there that goes. And Keith is going to untap. He'll take a draw. We know it's not a creature. It is a land, which means he can Monstrosity his Dragon. He will use the emblem on Domri. Oftentimes, that's the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, very rare that someone beats Domri Ultimate, and it's certainly not going to be Lundquist with a hand of Plains and Daring Skyjack.
Congratulations to Christian Keith, starting his tournament off very nicely, defeating the reigning champion. Jun Monsters, 1-0 so far in this tournament. Ben Lundquist, back against the wall already in this 10-round tournament, takes a loss with white-red aggro. But a good start to the day, and two decks that, are kind of fringe players when you think about it. You don't see a lot of white-red aggro. You see Jun Monsters a little bit, but nowhere near as much as we saw over the past couple of weeks. But that's kind of just a standard format that we're in right now. Just there's a lot of different options for people to play, and really none of them are poor choices.
Yeah, White Weenie is a especially interesting example of this because you see so little of it. Online, I see close to zero of it. In the open series, we see very little of it. But people like Benjamin Lundquist and Pat Cox, who's someone I talk to regularly, who are advocates for the deck, see no reason why it's still not good. They still play them in all the standard tournaments that they play in, and they're tuning and modifying that deck. Pat, a bigger fan generally of playing black instead of red. Lundquist, a big fan of playing red instead of black. But still, Precinct Captain, Soldier of the Pantheon, that base is still advocated by a lot of really good players, even though we see